Chapter 12. Big Lindsay Vanderbeck was still from the mighty man he had once been. Even prepared as Jim was, he felt a shock of dismay at his father's thinness and the pallor under his seamed weather-beaten skin. But inwardly he was unchanged. There was courage in his twinkly grey eyes as he joked about his own feebleness. "What do you think I raised you big galoots for?" he asked. "Just so I could sit around in my old age and be comfortable, that's all. This is going to be a good practice for me. I ain't ever had a chance to sit and watch other folks till now, and it certainly is a handsome sight." Wrapped up in plenty of warm clothes, he was sitting on the big chopping block back of the cabin, while Jim and Lindsay sawed firewood. He listened with an eager interest to the boys' accounts of their trapping. "That sounds like a pretty good catch of fur," he commented. "But you youngsters have to step lively to keep ahead of me when I get going again. I aim to set up all the south shore of the lake and along those brooks that run on to Waba River. The girls have got a nice little line working already. Take a look at that fur in that shed. Must be $100 worth, I should think. Maybe more if the prices are good." Jim threw a fresh log into the crotch of the sawhorse and paused to stretch his arms. "Tell you what, Dad," he said. "Lindsay and I can make a start on that line down the brook while we're here. Then you'll be all ready to tend traps in a week or so." "I don't want to keep you away from your grounds too long," his father answered. "But if you could take the time, that would be a big help for sure." The boys set out with one sled next morning and put in 2 days' work building cubbies and setting traps over to the eastward. Big Lindsay had built a small cabin on one of the streams and they spent the night there. As they were returning to Wapping the morning of December 13, they saw fresh snowshoe tracks leading off the trail. The prints were unblurred and distinct. Lindsay knelt for a minute, examining them, and beckoned to Jim. "Come on," he said. "It's Ida. See that place in the toe of the right shoe? I patched that for her the day I got here. She's in there tending trap. Let's go meet her." They had followed the trail a couple 100 yards when they heard their sister's voice from the other side of the thicket. "Oh, you beauty!" she exclaimed. "How am I going to get you out? You're a lot too pretty to kill." "Hey, what you got there?" called the younger brother, running near. As they came through the thicket, they saw a slim black animal caught in the trap. Its back was arched like an angry cat. It crouched facing its enemies with white teeth bared. "A fisher!" cried Jim. "And say, isn't she a little honey? Maybe we can take her alive, Ida. Let me have that gunny sack and I'll try it." He stepped closer to the trapped animal, holding open the bag of the empty sack. When he was near enough, he flipped it over the fisher's head and body and pressed it tightly into the snow while his prisoner thrashed and whirled around inside. "Open the trap, quick," he ordered, "before she hurts that leg." It took his brother only a few seconds to push down the spring and pry open the steel jaws. As the pressure was released, the fisher jerked her paw free and Jim picked her up in the bag. "There," he cried in triumph. "We'll fix her up a cage back at camp and you can keep her for a pet." When they reached the cabin and displayed their prize, there were cries of delight from Mary and her mother. "Oh, you poor little scared thing," Miss Vanderbeck said consolingly. "You're going to be taken care of now. Don't you fret. Boys, get busy right now and build some sort of pen for her. There's a roll of strong chicken wire in the shed." By supper time they had put up 4 solid posts and braced at the top and covered the cage with heavy fine mesh wire. In one corner was a little wooden hut with clean sawdust on the floor. When all was ready, Jim opened the sack and dropped the fisher gently inside the pen. She made a quick circuit of the wire, sniffing suspiciously at the hut, climbed up the mesh to investigate the top covering, and finally retired to a corner where she cowered as far from her captors as possible. Miss Vanderbeck came out with a piece of fish. "Go on now, everybody," she said, "and let Miranda and me get acquainted. I'm going to call her Miranda because she's such a handsome, darling little thing. I read a book once about a dark-haired girl that called that, and always thought it was a pretty name." Next morning, after the breakfast dishes were out of the way and the cabin straightened up, Miss Vanderbeck went back to the fisher's pen. The rest of the family, standing at a respectful distance, watched her approach slowly towards the wire. She was holding a bit of frozen whitefish and talking in a low, friendly voice. Miranda crouched in the corner outside her shelter. Her nose twitched and lifted towards the fish, but for several minutes she did not stir. Then, with a quick movement, she darted forward a foot or two. The woman waited, still speaking softly, and again the animal came nearer. This was repeated several times until Miranda stood on her hind legs, holding the side of the cage with her front paws and stretched up eagerly towards the food. Only then did Miss Vanderbeck push it slowly through the mesh and let the fisher take it from her fingers. "There now," she beamed. "She's all over being scared. I think she'll make a real pet." "Yeah, don't be getting too fond of her," rumbled Big Lindsay with a grin. "Remember, times are hard and that pelt's worth upwards of $50. Jim always known his mother had a way with animals. In other years they'd kept foxes, bear cubs, and even a full-grown lynx in captivity. In another pen, a short distance from Miranda, a pair of sleek brown minks had their home. All that day the boy's axe rang in the woods on the hill behind the camp. They hauled sled load after sled load of dried logs down to the cabin, and by nightfall there was a good 2 months' supply of firewood stacked up, ready for sawing. The girls would fit it for the stove as it was needed. Miss Vanderbeck had been baking most of the day. When Jim and Lindsay packed their toboggans, the morning of the 15th, each had several loaves of fresh bread carefully wrapped against the cold. 10 more days till Christmas," their mother reminded them. "You'll have time to get over your lines, but don't lose track of the calendar. We want to be all together Christmas Eve." She kissed each one of them with a hearty smack, and they shouted their farewells to the rest of the family, and the two teams trotted down the path to the cove. "So long, kid," said Jim as they reached the point. "Good luck with the traps. I won't be getting up to your country before Christmas, but I'll see you there." Their trails drew apart, and Lindsay's leading straight up the lake to the west, Jim's swinging northward. He waved a goodbye to his brother and led the dogs into the bush, headed for Porcupine. It was a cold, cloudy day with a hint of snow to come, but the boys' spirits were high and the dogs, well rested, pulled to the will. They made good time. Only one incident broke the day's steady travel. When they had gone a couple miles overland from Wabing, Jim, walking ahead, caught a glimpse of something alive in the brush a short ways off the trail. At the same moment, the dogs got the scent and began to bark. He silenced them with a quick command and stuck his snowshoes in front of the team to keep them from moving, and carried his rifle ready as he went forward towards the thicket. The animal had not moved again, but he was sure he could make out a blotch of cloudy gray fur between the spruce tips. As he rounded the edge of the bush, he paused in sheer astonishment. Squatting on its haunches in a rabbit path sat a big lynx, staring at him with unblinking yellow eyes. There was no sign of trap or cog. Instantly, Jim had whipped up his rifle, thinking the animal was fair game. Only when he looked down the sights did he realize the lynx was caught in a snare. Above it, a slender sapling bent in a curve, and from the tip of the tree to the beast's neck ran a light, taut cord. It was a common white string, hardly bigger than the twine used in the store in Nikina. The lynx could have broken it with a stroke of his paw, yet he sat, afraid to move. Jim had heard of this trait before. He knew that Indians sometimes caught the big cats in ordinary rabbit snares. Once the noose was round the neck, a lynx would stay till found, or it would die of starvation. "Well, old feller," he told the cat pityingly, "I can't do much for you because I reckon you belong to Joe Leeks. Still, there's no use letting you suffer." He lifted the rifle again and sent a merciful bullet into the round furry head. The boy got back to his home camp at sundown and began preparations for the morrow's trip down the squaw. He had been living high during the 4 days at Waba. Now he would go back to the sparse fare on the trail. Aside from the 2 loaves of home-baked bread he'd put in his wagon, there was only jerked meat, enough bacon to grease the frying pan, a little flour, tea, sugar, and salt. Waking before dawn next morning, he saw a gliding ribbon of white in the dark corner of the cabin. The weasel was back again, hunting mice around the grub chest. Jim sat up, chuckling. "You little devil, you," he murmured. "It's time you had a name. From now on, I'm going to call you Tiger. Tig for short. You hungry, Tig? Here." Beside him on the table there was a scrap of dried moose meat. He tossed in the corner, and the ermine crept towards it, its tiny nose sniffing suspiciously. A foot away it turned in dismay, and glided out of sight behind the grub box. What the little killer wanted was fresh hot blood. It was snowing in the night, but when the day broke fair, and Jim reached the long portage that afternoon. The traps on the way down had yielded 4 ermine and a mink, beside a number of rabbits, which he gave to the dogs. Leaving the team at camp, at the head of the carry he pushed on across, breaking trail. It was just sunset when he came out on the river ice. Across from him on the opposite bank the bush parted, and a large buck deer stepped daintily forth. Barely more than 50 feet away it paused to look straight at him. Then, without a sign of fear, it trotted quietly down river and into the woods again on the nearer side. "Guess you must keep track of the calendar," Jim remarked at the buck's vanishing tail flag. 3 weeks ago you'd have been in season, and I bet I couldn't have got within half a mile of you. He turned back up the portage trail and reached camp before dark. As soon as supper was finished and he had skinned his fur, he crawled into the sleeping bag. Breaking trail for 9 or 10 hours on end was tiring, even to long, powerful legs like Jim's. Again he was up before dawn, making ready for the next stretch of travel. The first 2 miles over the path he had trampled the night before was easy going. Then they struck the deep snow down the river and began plodding more slowly. There was nothing in the first few traps the boy visited. He had began to think his luck had turned him, when a commotion in the snow ahead restored his hopes. Some sort of dark animal was floundering near one of the trap houses, trying to drag the cog through an alder brush. Jim ran forward, eager to get a closer view of his catch. It was smaller than a fox, smaller than a fisher, but its fur was a beautiful jet black. Another few steps and he saw it had a stripe of white running down its back along with the full furred tail. "What in thunder?" he muttered in exclamation. Here was a new kind of animal, something he had never seen in all of his experience in the bush. He came within 4 or 5 yards, still wondering what such a rare pelt might be worth. Then suddenly he halted. A wave of strange, rank odor engulfed him. Coughing, half strangling, he backed off hastily. Even the dogs were cowering in the trance, sniffing and snorting their disdain. At last Jim knew what was in his trap. He had heard stories about skunks. He drew a deep breath and held it, advancing with the rifle raised. His shot was hurried, but it took devastating effect, blowing the black and white beast almost to pieces. With relief, the boy breathed again, and instantly regretted it. The nauseous fumes were thicker and more overpowering than ever. He stumbled back to the dogs and led them in a wide circuit, passing the area as far to the other side of the river as he could get. All that afternoon the scent hung around him, and even when he reached Beaver Lake that night he hung his outer clothes in the trees outside rather than sleep with it in the cabin. Before bed, Jim took out his diary and wrote in the little black book. December 17. To Beaver Lake. Got 1 skunk, first I ever saw or caught. He is very foul. Alive, shoot him. Smells worse, so I leave him, trap and all.